In the last lecture of the Behavioral Sciences module, let's go over social stratification. You can't talk about social stratification without talking about social class, which is why we're going to go into that first. Social class revolves around socioeconomic status, or SES for short. There are two types of status. The first is ascribed status, which is involuntary, and derives from identifiable traits. Examples of these are age, gender, ethnicity, family income, etc. Achieved status, on the other hand, is acquired through individual efforts. An example of this is if you went to college, got your degree, and went to med school and became a doctor. That's an achieved status. You earned that one. You weren't born into it. Social classes are categories of people with the same SES. Social capital refers to the investment people make into their society in return for economic or collective rewards. An example of this would be volunteering for your local church or a nonprofit organization. You don't necessarily get a physical value out of it. For example, you don't get paid to do it or any other compensation. However, the connections and ties that you make through those sorts of organizations and activities will lead to their own reward. This is what we would call social capital. Social reproduction is the passing of social inequality from one generation to the next. It's a measure of poverty from generation to generation, usually. Speaking of poverty, there are two types of poverty. Absolute poverty is when people do not have the resources to meet their needs, whereas relative poverty, in comparison, is poverty in reference to a larger population. An example of relative poverty would be if you were living in a group that generally had a higher standard of living than you. You might consider yourself poor, when in actuality, you still do have the resources to meet your needs, so you're not in absolute poverty. You just seem to be in a relative poverty. Social exclusion is when one feels alienated from society. This is generally a sentiment that is felt by people who are living in poverty or in lower SES. Spatial inequality is the formation of social stratification across territories and the populations living in these territories. Here's a few examples. In urban areas, they usually have more diverse economic opportunities and more social mobility, but they also tend to have more low-income and racial ethnic minority neighborhoods. High-income suburbs usually tend to form in response to this. This is largely true for most urban areas. Environmental injustice is the uneven distribution of environmental hazards in a community. Lower income areas tend not to have the power to prevent these hazards. An example of this would be if a factory chose to make a sanitation dumping ground near a community of people in a lower SES. Because of their status, this neighborhood would not have the ability or social capital to prevent this from happening, and this can lead to harmful health effects for that population. Now that we've covered a little bit of social class, let's move into the meat and potatoes of this lecture, epidemiology and disparities. First off, let's talk about incidence and prevalence. Incidence is calculated as the number of new cases of a disease per population at risk in a given period. An example would be the number of new cases of lung cancer per 1,000 at-risk people per year. Prevalence, on the other hand, is calculated as the number of cases of a disease per population in a given period of time overall, whether new or chronic, per population. An example would be the number of people with new or chronic lung cancer per 1,000 people per year. These are two slightly different ways to calculate the onset of disease. Make sure you know the distinction going into test day. Morbidity and mortality often go hand in hand, unfortunately, but they're slightly different. Morbidity is the burden or degree of illness associated with the disease. So, long story short, how bad the symptoms are and how severe you'll suffer. Mortality is the death caused by a given disease. If something has a high morbidity, it often has a high mortality as well. In our last portion of this lecture, let's go ahead and talk about factors that affect healthcare. One of the most prevailing factors in healthcare is poverty. It's often associated with worse health outcomes due to inability to receive proper care and not having the resources to get the care needed. This leads to decreased life expectancy, higher risk of disease, and higher suicide-homicide rates within these populations. Ethnicity does matter as well. Within certain ethnic minorities, they have worse health profiles than others, and this varies from group to group. An example of this would be in the Hispanic populations, you tend to see higher onsets of diabetes. You could say this could be from a lower SES, but factors such as diet also contribute to this. Gender. Gender also dictates a lot of health factors. For example, females tend to have better health profiles than men. They also have higher life expectancy, lower rates of disease, and higher rates of accessing health resources than men. However, females often have higher rates of chronic disease and morbidity rates. Prejudice also affects your health. It's based on sexual orientation, obesity, external appearance, race, and SES. This can affect your access to healthcare and the quality of care. Over the past couple decades, there have been efforts to try and improve healthcare in this country. Many changes have been implemented to try and make it more accessible for underserved populations. Examples of this are Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. In addition to this, many private organizations have also contributed to forming nonprofits and more accessible forms of healthcare to these populations. Although they're not perfect, they're going in the right direction, and you can say that at least they're making an effort. However, the efficacy of these programs is still controversial, and there really is no concise solution as to how to make healthcare more accessible to everyone. Alright, so that'll do it for behavioral sciences. You've stuck it out. Congratulations. Now, be mindful though, there are still other modules for you to look into to prepare for test day. Consider this a step in the right direction. Join us in the next modules as we cover other topics that you'll see on the MCAT.